The card on the table said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." I read it 3 times before I set it down. It was the one my daughter had given me last year. I'd kept it tucked behind the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter, the way I kept most things that mattered. Small, quiet, out of the way. Outside, the maple in the backyard had already dropped most of its leaves. November in Sudbury does that. It doesn't ask permission. One week, the tree is burning orange and red, and the next, it's just bare branches against a gray sky, and you wonder how you missed the moment it changed. I'd been retired for 3 years by then, 31 years as an administrative coordinator at Health Sciences North, and when they gave me the send-off luncheon in the second-floor boardroom, my daughter stood up and gave a little speech. She said I was the kind of woman who made everyone around her feel taken care of. She said she hoped she'd learned that from me. I kept that speech too, not written down anywhere, just in the part of me that still believed it. My name is Dorothy. I was 66 years old that November, and I lived alone in the house on Lorne Street, where I had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and learned, slowly and painfully, what it means to confuse love with availability. I want to tell you about Thanksgiving. Not the Thanksgiving where everything went wrong. That came later. I want to start with the one before the one that made me believe we were fine. It was 2 years earlier. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's who she is, had just moved into the new house in Barrie with her husband, and they were hosting for the first time. She called me in September, excited, asking if I would bring my tourtière. Her husband's family had never had it. She wanted to show them something of ours. Something French, Canadian, something that smelled like my mother's kitchen in Chelmsford. I made 2 of them. I drove 2.5 hours down the 400 inches the rain, and when I walked through the door, her face lit up in a way that made every kilometer worth it. Her mother-in-law, a pleasant enough woman from Oakville, asked me for the recipe. I told her it was my grandmother's and that I'd write it out for her. I never did. Not because I was keeping it from her. I just forgot. There were dishes to wash, grandchildren to chase, a bottle of Niagara Red that disappeared faster than I expected. I drove home that night in the dark, a little tired, a little full, and very happy. I held on to that evening for a long time. The following year, my daughter mentioned that they were thinking of doing Thanksgiving at the in-laws' place in Oakville. Just easier, she said. Fewer people driving long distances. I said, of course. That made sense, and I meant it. I spent the weekend with my friend Paulette instead. We made soup and watched old films, and it was perfectly fine. What I didn't realize was that perfectly fine had become a pattern. The year after that, the year I need to tell you about, my daughter called in late August. The timing should have told me something. August. 4 weeks before Thanksgiving. That's not how you call someone to make plans. That's how you call someone to deliver news you've already decided. She said, "Mom, we're doing Thanksgiving at Derek's parents' place again this year. Just immediate family, his side. Me and Derek, the kids." I was standing at the kitchen sink. I remember because I turned off the tap. I wanted to hear her clearly. "Okay," I said. "I knew you'd understand. You're always so good about these things." I want to sit with that sentence for a moment. You're always so good about these things. I have turned it over in my mind many times since. What it really means, I think, is, you never make it difficult for us to leave you out. What I didn't tell her on that phone call, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was that I had already been planning something. I want to back up. In January of that year, I had found a property rental listing for a cottage on Georgian Bay, 6 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a dock that jutted out over the water. The listing said the fall colors from the dock at Thanksgiving weekend were something you had to see in person. I had looked at that listing for 3 months before I booked it. I was thinking of my granddaughters. The older one had just turned 7, the younger one had turned 4 in March, and I kept thinking about how fast it goes. I knew that. I had watched it go once already. I wanted them to have a memory, a real one, the kind that smells like wood smoke and lake water and has enough room for everyone to spread out and still find each other. I put down the deposit in April, $400, non-refundable, on my Visa. The full rental was $2,200 for the long weekend. I had the money. I'd been careful with my pension and my savings, the way my mother taught me, the way women of a certain generation learn to be careful because no one is coming to catch you if you fall. I told my daughter about it in May. I called her on a Sunday afternoon, and I walked her through the whole thing. The cottage, the dock, the 6 bedrooms so Derek's parents could join if they wanted, the kayaks included in the rental, the fire pit. She said, "Mom, that sounds so beautiful." She said, "The girls are going to absolutely love it." She said, "Let me talk to Derek and get back to you." She got back to me in August. You already know what she said. I stood at the kitchen sink and I said, "Okay," and I turned the tap back on. That evening I sat at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, and I looked at the booking confirmation email. $2,200. Thanksgiving weekend. Georgian Bay. 6 bedrooms. I thought about my granddaughters. I thought about a dock and fall colors and wood smoke. Then I thought about the $400 deposit I had already paid, non-refundable, and the remaining balance due in 3 weeks. I thought about what my daughter had said. Just immediate family. I was not immediate family. I want you to understand something. I did not cry. I am not telling you this to make myself sound strong. I am telling you because I think the not crying matters. There was a time when my husband was first gone, when the grief was still acute, when I cried easily, over small things. A song on the radio, an empty chair. But grief, if you survive it, teaches you something about what is actually worth your tears. This wasn't grief. This was something quieter and colder. This was recognition. I had seen this coming for 2 years. I had just refused to look directly at it. I closed the laptop. I washed my one dinner dish. I went to bed. For 3 days, I did nothing. I went to my water aerobics class at the YMCA on Tuesday morning. I had lunch with Paulette on Wednesday. I did not mention the cottage to her. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, because saying it out loud would mean admitting what I already knew, that I had built something beautiful in my imagination, and my daughter had walked right past it without looking. On Thursday evening, I called my friend, Rosemary. She'd been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together at Saint-Denis, back when we both drove carpools and traded recipes and complained about winter in equal measure. Rosemary understood things without needing them explained. I told her about the cottage. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy, are you going to let that cottage go to waste?" I said I didn't know what I was going to do yet. She said, "I have 2 weeks of vacation I haven't touched, and Linda has been saying since March that she needs to get out of the city." I said, "Rosemary," she said, "6 bedrooms is a lot of bedrooms." I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a car went past on Lorne Street, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling. "Let me think about it," I said. I thought about it for 1 day. On Friday afternoon, I texted my daughter. I said, "I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Give the girls a hug from me." Then I called Rosemary back, and I told her to call Linda. Here is what I want to tell you about the 3 weeks between that phone call and Thanksgiving weekend. I did not feel righteous. I did not feel victorious. I felt something more complicated than that. a kind of grief mixed with relief, like setting down a bag you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. I went to the cottage supply aisle at Canadian Tire, and I bought 2 good quality wine glasses to add to whatever was already there. I ordered a book I'd been meaning to read for a year. I confirmed with Rosemarie and Linda, and, eventually, with 2 other women from my water aerobics class, Bev and Marguerite, that we were all going. 5 women, all of us somewhere between 63 and 71, all of us carrying the particular exhaustion of women who had spent decades making sure everyone else was comfortable. I did not call my daughter to tell her any of this. She called me the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. She was cheerful. She said, "What are you up to this weekend, Mom? Staying cozy?" I said, "Actually, I'm heading to the cottage on Georgian Bay. I found some friends to go with." There was a pause. She said, "Oh, the cottage you booked?" "Yes," I said. Another pause. Then, "That's nice, Mom. I'm glad it worked out." She sounded uncertain. Not guilty, I want to be honest about that. She didn't sound like a woman who knew she had done something wrong. She sounded like someone who had just realized there was a version of events she hadn't considered. "Have a good Thanksgiving," I said. "Kiss the girls for me." I drove up on the Friday morning. The 400 North, past Barrie, past the exit that leads to my daughter's house, and then up past Parry Sound and along the bay. The trees were extraordinary. Rosemarie in the passenger seat kept saying, "Oh, every few minutes," like someone surprised by beauty they should have expected. The cottage was everything the listing promised. Better even, because listings can't smell the cold air off the water, the pine boards of the porch, the very specific smell of a cottage fireplace that hasn't been lit in months but still holds the memory of every fire before it. Bev, who had grown up in Northern Ontario and knew things the rest of us didn't, got the fire pit going before it was even dark. Marguerite, who had retired from teaching at Laurentian University and took everything slightly too seriously in the most charming possible way, had brought 2 bottles of Taw's Riesling from the Niagara Peninsula and a small wheel of cheese she kept calling the important one. We ate dinner on the porch with blankets over our laps because none of us were willing to go inside yet. The bay was flat and dark, and the birch trees at the water's edge had gone pale yellow, almost luminous in the last of the light. Linda, who rarely talked about her divorce, even though it had happened 4 years ago and clearly still lived somewhere close to the surface, said, "I don't know why I don't do things like this more often." Nobody answered, because we all knew why. We'd all spent too many years organizing ourselves around other people's schedules, other people's comfort, other people's definitions of what the holiday was supposed to look like. On Saturday morning, I woke up before the others. I made a pot of coffee. They'd left a bag of good ground coffee in the cupboard, Timothy's, dark roast, and I took it out to the dock in my coat and my wool socks, and I sat on the edge and watched the bay wake up. The water was very still. There was mist coming off it in thin threads. A loon called from somewhere I couldn't see, that long descending sound that always makes my chest ache a little, not from sadness exactly, but from something that doesn't have a clean name in English. In French, we might say dépaysement, the feeling of being somewhere other than where you usually are, and noticing, suddenly, that you're still yourself. I thought about my granddaughters. I missed them. I want to be honest about that too. I missed them specifically and physically, the way you miss something warm when you step outside in November. I thought about the younger one, who had recently decided that my reading glasses were fascinating and would put them on her face and look up at me with exaggerated seriousness. I thought about how the older one, last Christmas, had fallen asleep against my arm watching a movie and had smelled of shampoo and something else. Something entirely her own, Some particular version of child smell that I knew I would not be able to recall exactly in 10 years, and that broke my heart a little to know. I missed them, and I was here. Both things were true. I thought about the deposit. $400, non-refundable. I thought about the $2,200 total. I thought about the fact that I had paid for this cottage as a gift for people who had made other plans, and that I was now here with women who had rearranged their lives at 3 weeks' notice to sit with me on a dock in Georgian Bay, and that maybe the money had ended up exactly where it was supposed to be. There is a thing that happens, I think, when you reach your 60s, and you are a woman who has been useful her whole life. People, not cruel people, not even careless people, just people who have gotten used to a certain arrangement, begin to relate to you primarily in terms of what you provide. You become, as one woman I know once said, a function rather than a person. You are the one who remembers birthdays and makes the tourtière and drives 2.5 hours in the rain and books the cottage on Georgian Bay. You are available. And because you are available, and because you have always made yourself available, it begins to seem to everyone, perhaps even to yourself, that your availability is simply a fact of nature, like the 400 North or November, or the way the maple drops its leaves without asking permission. The loon called again, closer this time. I held my coffee cup in both hands, and I thought, I am not a function. I am Dorothy. I am 66 years old, and I raised 2 children, and I worked for 31 years, and I saved carefully, and I loved generously. And I am sitting on a dock on Georgian Bay on a Saturday morning in October, and the water is perfectly still, and I am not a function. I said it out loud quietly to the mist, just to hear it. Rosemary appeared behind me about 20 minutes later, in her coat and her husband's old fishing hat that she'd worn ironically for so long it had become sincere. She sat down beside me on the dock without saying anything and held her hand out for my coffee cup. I gave it to her. She drank from it and handed it back. We sat like that for a while. Then she said, "How are you doing?" "Actually," I said, "I think I'm okay. I think I might be better than okay." She nodded. "Good." "I don't think she meant to hurt me," I said. "My daughter. I don't think she even knows." "No," Rosemary said. "That's almost the whole problem, isn't it?" I turned that over. "Yes," I said. "I think that's exactly the problem. Thanksgiving Sunday, the 5 of us made dinner together. There was no turkey. We'd agreed beforehand that a 10-pound bird for 5 people who were mostly there for the sides was an exercise in obligation rather than pleasure. Linda made roasted squash with maple and thyme. Marguerite made her mother's potato gratin, which had more cream in it than any of us cared to calculate. Bev made a wild rice stuffing with dried cranberries and toasted pecans that she said was an old recipe from a friend in Sudbury, Algoma. I made the tourtière. We set the table on the porch, which was perhaps overly optimistic, given that it was October in Ontario. We ate with our coats on, which should have been miserable, and instead became one of the funniest evenings I can remember. Marguerite dropped her fork off the edge of the porch. Bev told a story about a Thanksgiving from 20 years ago that involved a dog, a gravy boat, and a very unfortunate sequence of events that I will not describe here, except to say that it ended with her mother-in-law never speaking to the dog again. We laughed until we were cold. Then we went inside and laughed some more. I did not check my phone until Sunday night. There were 2 photos my daughter had sent the girls in matching sweaters at a table full of people I recognized as Derek's family. The girls looked happy and well-fed and utterly at ease. I looked at those photos for a long time. My chest did the complicated thing again. I wrote back, "They look so beautiful. Give them my love." Then I put my phone face down on the nightstand and fell asleep to the sound of the bay. I want to tell you about the drive home. We left Monday morning, after breakfast, after one last cup of coffee on the dock, in full defiance of the cold. The bay was rougher than it had been. The wind had come up overnight, the way it does in October, and there were small whitecaps on the water that hadn't been there before. The birch trees had lost more of their yellow. The season was moving on. Rosemarie and I drove back down the 400 together. She was quiet for the first hour, the way she gets when she's turning something over. Then she said, "Are you going to say anything to your daughter? About how you felt?" I thought about it for longer than I expected. "Not yet," I said. "Maybe eventually, but not yet." "Fair enough," she said. "I need to figure out what I want to say first, and I need to figure out what I want from the conversation." I signaled to pass a slow truck. I've had too many conversations in my life where I said things I hadn't figured out yet. They don't tend to land well. Rosemarie laughed. "That's very wise, Dorothy. Don't compliment me," I said. "I'm still working it out." She laughed again. I passed the exit for Barry, the exit for my daughter's house. I looked at the sign the way you look at something you're choosing to pass. I kept driving. When I got home to Lorne Street, I carried my bag inside and stood for a moment in the kitchen. The house was the same as I'd left it. Quiet. The fruit bowl. The card I'd kept behind it. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," from last year. I picked up the card. I read it again. "I hope she'd learned that from me," my daughter had said in that speech 3 years ago. The kind of woman who makes everyone around her feel taken care of. I thought, that's a lovely thing to aspire to. I hope she does learn it. And then I thought, I hope I learn something different. I hope I learn to be the kind of woman who takes care of herself first. Not instead of others. I don't think that's in my nature, and I'm not sure I'd want it to be. But first, before the tourtière, before the $400 deposit, before the 2.5-hour drive in the rain, before the "of course that makes sense," and the okay and the careful, quiet removal of myself from rooms where I am not being invited, I set the card down. I went to the calendar on the wall, the one from the Sudbury Multicultural Festival that I buy every year because I like the photographs, and I turned to December. I wrote in my own handwriting, in the square for Christmas Eve, "Call Rosemarie. Call Paulette. Make plans." Not plans contingent on anyone else's schedule. My plans. A few weeks later, my daughter called on a Sunday afternoon. She mentioned, carefully, that Derek's mother might be coming to stay with them at Christmas this year, that things were a little complicated, that she hoped I understood. I said, "Of course." Then I said, "I'm actually thinking about going to Nova Scotia for the holidays. Rosemarie's daughter lives in Lunenburg, and she mentioned there was room if we wanted to come." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A real one this time. "Oh," my daughter said, "I didn't know you were thinking about that." "I just decided," I said. Which was true. I decided as I was saying it. "Well," she said, and then, "That sounds really nice, Mom." "I think it will be," I said. And when I hung up, I stood by the kitchen window and looked out at the maple in the backyard, bare now, all its leaves long gone, just the clean, dark branches against a white November sky. Patient, rooted, not waiting for permission to become something again in the spring. I thought, that's enough for today. I put the kettle on and I called Rosemarie.